everybody, and welcome to this fourth seminar in the series Illicit Economies, Violence and Development. And the series is organised by RUSI with CIVAD, which is a research centre in SOAS, and we're looking forward to a really interesting discussion today. Just to give you a few housekeeping rules before we begin, please turn off your microphones and your cameras. If any of you have any problems viewing the PowerPoints that are going to come up, then go into your View tab, because you can play around with the settings around Gallery. And could you please post questions in the chat? And we hope for lots of really interesting questions and lots of interesting discussion. We're trying to keep as much time for that as possible. And please remember, this is being recorded. So, what is the topic? The topic is a really important and interesting one: militias, coercive brokerage, and public authority. What is very interesting, I think, about the topic is that it's in different moments in time, certain themes emerge which we need to engage with. But often as academics, we're a bit behind the reality. And what I think is interesting in this case is we've got two scholars with us today who have been very much on top of this reality for some time. I'm going to introduce them in a minute. But just to say a little bit about the importance of the theme. I mean, for me, the importance of the theme is very much about rethinking our assumptions about the Weberian understanding of the state today. That concept of the state has these three very big elements: state monopoly of violence, the question of legitimacy, and the question of territory. And we're going to be discussing to what extent in the world today we are actually still seeing a trajectory to state monopolization of violences rather than state diffusion of violences, and what role do different armed groups and armed actors play in that trajectory. The issue of legitimacy is extremely important because what is going on in terms of who has the right to use violence, and these new actors, new, not so new, some, but their relationship with the state is problematizing that understanding of legitimacy. And the issue of territory is very important because a lot of what we're going to talk about, and this is a very big issue for SOAS and CIVAD, is the role of borderlands and frontiers, that field of political life and social and economic life in which many of these armed actors that we're calling militias for the minute are emerging, or have emerged over time, for some time. And in terms of the language we're using, the concept, we're using the word militias, but of course there are other ideas and ideas behind that understanding of armed actors. We could, and I'm sure Francisco will talk about paramilitaries in the Colombian situation. If we look at Ukraine, we're actually talking increasingly about the mercenaries of the Wagner group. And there are other names that we're giving to these groups. And we shouldn't forget that this is not just a problem of the global south, because the term militias is actually also used in the United States. And we saw the fact that some would argue that militias were actually involved in the assault on Congress a year ago. So that understanding and the names we use to the terminology for these armed groups is very important, and we're going to be discussing that. And then we have the whole issue of coercive brokerage. And I'm going to leave Francisco to talk about that, because it's a concept that he has developed in the context of Colombia, but we now recognize in this seminar series that actually that and in other research that terminology actually has a lot of resonance in other parts of the world. And then the third concept, is public authority. So here we are looking at the fact that a lot of these armed actors are not sort of somehow peripheral outside the state, completely different from the state, but actually interact with state actors in different ways and with politics. And that is a really important theme on the world today. So I think we're talking about themes that are of great importance and in many parts of the world. So we have here two contributors today who have a lot of work and experience on these issues. So Francisco Gutiérrez Sanín, who's going to start us off from Colombia. He is a researcher at the Instituto de Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales of the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, the National University of Colombia. He's written a lot of books, and I'm only going to be able to sum up a couple of those recent ones. Most recently, his book, Clientelistic Warfare, Paramilitaries in the State in Colombia, 1982 to 2007, published by Palgrave in 2019. And his more recent book in 2020, Hacia un nuevo ciclo de violencia, towards a new cycle of violence in Colombia. And then a recent article, Managing Life Trajectories, Institutionalized Calamity and Illegal Peasants in Colombia, in Third World Quarterly 2022. And Antonio Giustozzi, who is also extremely experienced. He's currently Senior Research Fellow at RUSI and is the author, among many other works, of Taliban at War, which came out in 2022, and Empires of Mud, about Afghanistan's warlords. And he's also published extensively on Afghanistan's security. So we have two really well-informed analysts and academics and scholars working on this topic, and I hope we're going to have a really great debate. So Francisco, I will hand over to you to kick us off.
Many thanks. Thanks for the invitation, for your kind presentation, Jenny. And if I may add, we also produced an article, Antonio and me, about networks and armies, and about the structures, organizational blueprints in the midst of civil war, and why does that count? Okay, so next, Antonio. So the core ideas of coercive brokerage, as I understand it, is a little bit that paramilitarism in Colombia is clientelism on steroids. Sorry, Jenny?
We're losing you a bit, Francisco. You're breaking up a bit. So just we'll carry on for the minute, but just to
Now do you listen well?
Yes, yeah? Carry on.
Okay, perfect. So the idea is that Colombian paramilitarism actually was institutionally designed and also developed as and flowered into a variant of clientelism. Understanding clientelism as an intermediation between region and central states. So what the paramilitaries did was to transform this fundamental relationship between the central state and the regions, putting into the mix their access to large means of violence. And this was not only simply the adding of a new element, but the whole transformation of the relationship between territories and states. So this also feeds into this key concept of Michael Mann of indirect rule, according to which indirect rule is both a military strategy, in the Colombian case, a counterinsurgent military strategy, plus a form of rule, a specific form of government. And that form of government is thought originally in terms of Michael Mann, in this particular case, I think these terms can be accepted, in contrast to the Weberian bureaucratic state, because the relationship between the territories and the states is not coordinated by universalist bureaucracies, by large administrative structures, but by friendships, networks, and the delegation of powers, including the use of coercion to an assortment of territorial economic or territorially based economic elites and notables. Next. Next, Antonio. So let's say Colombia has a specificity. Of course, all cases have specificities, many of them, but this one is relevant for the discussion of the concept. A very long coexistence between liberal democracy, checks and balances, Congress and independent judiciary, etc., and the massive violence enacted by several actors, including state agencies. And before the counter-insurgent war, which can be dated, let's say, starting approximately at the mid-1970s or something, and the guerrillas being born in the 1960s, Colombia went through another cycle of violence called la violencia, paradigmatically, which pit one against other the two main political parties of the country, the liberals and the conservatives. And as described by contemporaries in the 1960s, many of these guerrillas could survive due to what a commentator from the RAND Corporation of the United States, an observer, called in the 1960s the Bogotá Tying. That meant that he was called Bandit, David Arjuri from the Liberal Party, could continue to act, continue to roam in the territory to extract resources, etc., thanks to the protection that notables gave to him, and which finally were implemented and accepted from the capital of the country. And basically, what I try to show in my book on clientelistic warfare is that precisely the Colombian paramilitaries first were created in this direction, because contrary to other Latin American countries in which we had the savage concentration of coercion into dictatorships to implement counterinsurgent and anti-subversive offensives throughout the 1960s and the 1970s. In Colombia, what we had was the delegation of institutionally decided the delegation of powers to local notables who would have the sponsorship of the army to fight against the guerrillas. So from the very beginning, the Colombian paramilitaries colonized the highly clientelistic Colombian policy, and they transformed traditional intermediation, traditional clientelism in several ways, some of them quite dramatic. For example, killing the adversaries of the politicians who they supported, not necessarily leftists, but simply other traditional politicians, but also, for example, allowing new ways through which the municipal budgets could be sacked and could be transformed under the combination of context provided by clientelistic networks and the use of coercion. But there is no free lunch in this. What I show is that these dynamics created a huge problems of collective action, and besides, of course, an extremely brutal, massive humanitarian crisis, which finally helps to explain the demobilization of the paramilitaries. If we don't take into account this, there's no way of explaining why the paramilitaries finally decided to demobilize. Next. So there is a possible counter-argument, look, and it's a reasonable counter-argument, so it has to be taken into account. Look, in Colombia, there was a maddening longitudinal and regional variation. The militias were very different from each other. Different works on this same topic. For example, the excellent works of Patrick Meehan on this. I don't know if he's here, but in Myanmar showed that also there are big differences between different militias. So how can you say that finally there was a kind of trend that ended picking up all the territorial dynamics of the paramilitaries in the country? And indeed, probably one could find exceptions, etc. But all in all, what one could say is that if you see in an aggregated fashion, there was a massive convergence between the traditional political system and the bloody paramilitary saga. And what evidence that shows this is that the horizon of imagination of the Colombian paramilitaries was not determined, for example, by the perspective of a coup or a bloodbath or something. Of course, the bloodbath, they were implementing it big time in the territories, but they were not thinking of a regime change. Actually, I have looked in minute detail for any pushist or coup attempt, pushist dynamic or coup attempt by the paramilitaries, and I haven't been able to find a single one. Their horizon of imagination was the next election, and of course they killed a lot of people, etc., to win that the next election. Next. And this heat map shows a little bit this. Of course, there is much more evidence, but I am simply showing this as a kind of heuristics which can illustrate the point. This takes Colombian departments. You know that Colombia has basically 3 territorial administrative units: the municipality, the department, and the central states. So the departments are anyways very important in the country. And the dark threads departments are those that had in that period 2 or more paramilitary governors. Many of these departments, which and I repeat what Jenny was saying, yeah, because it is thought that this was due to the weakness of the state or the marginality of certain regions. No, many of these departments were absolutely central, economically, demographically, and politically to the Colombian state, and they were really at the municipal and departmental levels taken by the paramilitaries through massive and open political projects. The orange departments are those intermediate ones, and the light brown departments were those that had rather low paramilitary influence. Disregard, please, the ones which are in yellow, which I simply didn't have enough data to classify. So this map shows quite well that there was a huge colonization of the political system by the Colombian paramilitaries at the peak of their activity. Next. So it is not so obvious to understand why would paramilitaries get involved in electoral politics. They could have tried other ways, etc. And why would politicians establish links with the paramilitaries? One could say, okay, they gained a lot, but remember that in Colombia there was anyway an independent judiciary. A lot of them went to the jail. To make a comparison, the Militias operation in Italy against the mafia threw into jail like 20-25 Congress people. In Colombia, it has thrown into the jail the offensive against the paramilitaries, I think that more than 70. And besides, they were aware of this. They could easily be killed by the paramilitaries. But I think that there are. So of course they had advantages, but also they ran into huge risks, etc. But I think there are two major explanations that directly feed into this concept of coercive brokerage. First of all, and here as we have spoken with Jonathan Goodhand, etc., there is this classic author on the mafia, Anton Bloch, who showed that the construction of sovereignty between the mafia, it was not a construction of sovereignty against the mafia in the south of Italy, at least the part that was being studied by Bloch, but between the mafia and the central state with a lot of tensions, and also the construction of markets themselves, of production and extraction. So, and this included, as Bloch already had shown, but in the Colombian case, this is also massive, highly globalized markets. And on the other hand, the concept of indirect rule by man, and the idea that, and this is clearly seen in the Colombian case, indirect rule is not only a form of governance, but also a military strategy through which different powers and access to large means of violence is delegated to regional and local notables to keep at bay the subversive enemy. And of course, as already said, but I think it is worthwhile to emphasize this generated huge social impasses. But I was going to provide evidence, but I'm already relatively low on time, so let's go to the next one. So let's skip next. So I wanted simply here to show two cases, which are Hernán Giraldo and the Bloque Norte, of two paramilitary units, one which operated in Santa Marta, and the other one which operated throughout all the Caribbean coast, and that actually eventually overwhelmed the Bloque Norte, overwhelmed the paramilitary group of Hernán Giraldo. But the point, besides the horrible crimes they committed, Hernán Giraldo was an egregious sexual delinquent, and Jorge Cuarenta was a genocidal leader. I think there's no other form of characterizing him. But what is directly of interest for our discussion here is the differences in which they took over the coordination, the territorial coordination between these administrative units, municipality departments, etc., and the central state. So while for Hernán Giraldo, the idea was to build a closed territory, a territory under his strict control, in which for which he relied on political intermediaries only as auxiliaries to maintain the flow of resources in exchange for votes and political deference. The model of the Bloque Norte was a model of open territories, in which a lot of state agencies were operating, not only the army and the police, which were in essence in a strategic alliance with the paramilitaries, but also several other civilian bureaucracies, and also the main war economies of Giraldo and the Bloque Norte were different. In the case of Giraldo, it was mainly the two illegal crop bonanzas that took place in his territory, which were marijuana first and then coca, while in the case of the Bloque Norte, it was a legal war economy, basically large cattle ranching and also palm oil, both massively supported by the state, by the way. So let's go to the next. So what I would correct or let's say what I would develop, or what I have seen and what I have written on these issues, is that this contrast between the Hernán Giraldo experience and the Jorge Cuarenta experience shows that there are several varieties of coercive brokers. According to first, organizational principles and blueprints. Second, territorial control. I think this is absolutely fundamental. The types of territorial control that some paramilitaries tried to establish with their politicians were very different from others. The type of territory. We have borderlands. In the case of Giraldo, it was a maritime borderland. This allows, for example, a link to global markets, a very comfortable link to global markets through which illegal goods can be smuggled. The class composition of the leadership, this is also absolutely fundamental. The type of war economies and also the politicians and friends that they cultivated. There is a fantastic phrase from a paramilitary, actually quite notable paramilitary, Paulo Hernán Sierra, which I quote in the book, when he was asked, what kind of politics did you make? Everybody thought that he was going to say, I don't know, anti-subversive, and he simply asked, he simply answered, no, what we always wanted to make is friends, which clearly resonates with Bloch and other authors, because who said the politics of the mafia was to find friends of friends of friends, amici degli amici. So of course, I am not implying that the paramilitaries were a mafia in the least, but I'm showing it that some concepts travel well from one empirical domain to the other. And in this case, this idea of indirect rule and the linking of territories with the central state through networks of friendship was absolutely fundamental. Next. And then the conceptual relevance of the thing would be, I think that at least would go in 4 directions. First of all, the Civil War literature, as Jenny highlighted, the Civil War literature has invested the best part of its energies in the latter years trying to explain why Civil War hasn't anything to do with politics, which is very strange disciplinarily. So as a political scientist, I want to show that this major phenomenon doesn't have anything to do with politics. But here you see that politics and actually very traditional forms of politics are articulated structurally, institutionally with the ways of doing war. Also with the rebel governance literature, of which I am very critical, and because it supposes that these armed groups like take over territories through usurpation against the state and against communities. And when one looks in detail into the paramilitary experience, one sees that this is simply hopeless, is completely implausible. And also to understand Antonio's slides, I think that show this very well, the liminal relationships in understanding by, I think that the dictionary, if I remind well, the dictionary definition of liminality is a state of transition. So there are permanent states of transition between crime and politics, which I think this relation, this idea of the linking between territories and the central state through private brokers and intermediaries clarifies and helps to understand much better than simply trying to depict a world in which you have the good guys on the one hand, which are the political types, and the bad guys on the other hand, which are the criminal types, and a bright red line separating one from the other. Here I have
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Yeah, I'm already ending. Here I have a beautiful quote by George Duby, who this is a law enacted by the King of Wessex in the 1100s, so like more than 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years ago, and he said about people in arms roaming in his territory, if they are less than 7, they form a band, but if they are more than 35, this is clearly a military campaign. So, of course, there are also issues of size, etc., that go into the mix. But I think that understanding these issues through the lens of coercive brokerage also clarifies that there is the relation between politics and criminality is is much more complicated. And simply to end, I think I still have a minute. So let's say there's also a possible argument saying, well, anyway, Colombia is a big outlier, et cetera, because it has this very long persistence between democracy and high frequency political violence, 60, 70, 80 years. So in this sense, I am afraid that we constitute a social and political platypus. But when you see large global trends and when you study in detail other cases, then you come to understand that no, that here we have, and I cite some of the recent literature, Ungor, Ferguson, these are books from 2021, 2022, which show that this paramilitary phenomenon and militia phenomenon is very widespread, and that here we have a quite, I think, significant comparative question underlying all this, which is what are the conditions for private counterinsurgent violence to develop. And I would believe that above a size and relevance threshold, yeah, if you have very small groups, they don't have to deal with politics, but eventually this will take you to some type of links between the militia, the political system, and processes of state formation. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Francisco. I think you've thrown up very important issues at the heart of this discussion, particularly this relationship between the nature of politics and these various armed groups and the variations. So let me turn to Antonio now.
And let me, before he starts, thank Antonio for administrating the slides.
Well, thanks. So I'm going to start now. I'm going to look at the case study of Afghanistan. And I will first start with a few notes on militias first, and then on coercive brokers. Militias, of course, have very bad press, but they're spreading everywhere, so they must be useful to somebody. There are certainly a wide range of actors who tend to form militias, ranging from powerful men, what used to be known as right-wing use of powerful men, today is often described or called militias. And of course, states manage for semi-regular force all the time. And today is common to refer to them to militias. And one of the rationale is that they're local and cheap. And local in reality really means something more like what Francisco was saying, a form of clientelistic warfare, which actually probably we should study more. It's not just about the kind of distribution of patronage that allows for the formation of the militia, but it's a very nature of this personal relationship at the local level that represent the strength of the militias in the absence of a strong, if you like, ideological force to fight on behalf of the state, because that's the only thing that you can feel usually if there is no strong armed force from the center. And then, of course, you can also have party militias, so armed groups that operate as military wings or parties. Communities form self-defense forces. It's common today to call them militias too. Gangsters, smugglers, when they grow in size and their gangs become bigger, they're often referred to as militia with some good reason. And of course, all kinds of political entrepreneurs operating in weak states often tend to form armed forces to support their cause or to co-opt or hijack section of the state and turning them into their, if you like, private armed force, and calling them militias also a very common. Of course, all these categories overlap to a large degree. Gangsters often work for states and vice versa. And smugglers are the same. Parties can be sometimes be aligned with the central authorities, if there are any. Strongmen can be co-opted to become militia leaders on behalf of the state. Communities can fight for governments, and so on and so forth. And with regard to coercive brokers, I'm not going to repeat what Francisco said, but I want to add some more notes. I think the value, the main value of coercive brokers is to act as agents for collective action. So basically brokering some kind of unity among disparate actors in an environment where there is little that can keep people or groups together. In that situation, anybody who can do this, who can bring together disparate groups, disparate individuals, has got quite a value, especially in the eyes of actors at the higher level. It could be states, could be political party, could be foreign actors as well. So basically, at the local level, away from the metropolis, this ability to bring people together, even with coercion, is often very valued. In the absence of anything better, it can be the only option. That's why even, of course, Western governments often, even Western democracies often, they've done it. They've done it as colonial powers. They've done it as powers intervening in more recent times in environments where they didn't have a strong foothold. It is important because it's not only, as we know, of course, to keep an army together, you need a degree of coercion. You cannot have an army without authority and coercion, but sometimes even just keeping together political movements and groups or controlling territory can be very difficult. It cannot be done simply with some good words, with some goodwill. Coercion is an essential ingredient, and that's where the coercive brokers have often value, even if they can be widely seen as disagreeable figures. I think the important question is whether coercive brokers are actually agents of state making, or in fact are agents of state dissolution. And I think there isn't really an answer. It could be either way. In abstract, not talking about Afghanistan yet at this point. Think of feudalism. Feudalism could be described as a coalition or a system based on coercive brokers operating at the local level, brought together at the center by some kind of central authority loosely in control. So it could be, they could also turn, or could also be ingredients of a particular type of state formation. But of course, it depends on the context, and depends also what other forces operate in society, and also operate at the international level, can have influence at the state level. So Afghanistan, I would be quick on this, is an interesting case study, simply because almost what I said so far applies to Afghanistan. I'm going to go through it again to save time, and I will go straight into the issue of what are coercive brokers, what have been coercive brokers in Afghanistan. And Central Afghanistan is a context where at different stages in its recent history, and certainly in 2001, there was a situation where multiple actors were roaming around the country. Few or almost nobody had a large degree of control. There were foreign forces in 2001 too, but in small numbers. There was no national army, no national police. Typical environment where coercive brokers could sell their services, could show some value to a variety of actors at the higher level. So the Afghan government, but also intervening powers from abroad. And it took quite a few years for Afghanistan to actually develop some kind of central army or professional police. And by the time the government had those forces, they were busy fighting a large-scale insurgency. So they were not actually often in a position to enforce the will of the central government in the districts and the provinces. So the role of coercive brokers in this context was to organize society in some way and protect, of course, specific interests. So they started forming as local actors to protect local interests. It could be land grabbers, who, of course, land grabbers, once they started appropriating land, they had to protect their wealth. Smugglers, who wanted to secure routes for their smuggling operations. It's certainly more convenient to have somebody in control than fighting each other all the time for the control of a particular route out of the country. Money interest, because of course, if you seize control over a gem mine, then of course you want to protect it. You want to have somebody protection. So all these different types of actors could see value in coercive brokers, and we're talking at the local level. And of course, this type of protection could be provided in a variety of ways. And of course, the local context here is decisive. So sometimes it was branches of security forces, which were actually originally were a coalition of loose militias, could be hijacked and turned into de facto private armies. Tribal militias, self-defense groups that proliferate in this insecure context could be repurposed and turned into private armies to protect this type of interest. Gangsters who already had a small armed retinue could, with more resources made available, turn into leaders or relatively large private armies. Anti-Taliban leaders who had lost the raison d'etre at the end of the war could find a new role for themselves. And one typical example, one of the most successful examples, was Atta Mohamedou, who became governor of a province in northern Afghanistan in 2004. Before that, he was essentially making a case for his value to the central government by essentially sidelining local competitors. It took a couple of years to emerge as a winner in these local power struggles. And essentially, by the time he was on top, he was accepted by then President Karzai, who made him governor, and recognized him as a local broker who could also serve the central government interest to some degree for want of better partners. And when Atta became governor, was in a position to use his power as a representative of the central government to essentially coerce all kinds of militias. He had his own militia, but there were a variety of other militias belonging to other leaders, other parties, gangsters, smugglers, common criminals, and he forced them essentially to accept to operate under his control, and imagine to discipline them and establish a degree of order. Of course, it was an order based on organized smuggling, organized crime, if you like, but nonetheless, some kind of order. And it probably too, the large part of the population prefer this kind of order to the anarchy and the constant conflict of the previous 2 years. So he made actually a lot of money for himself and for his allies, organizing land grabbing on a massive scale, and then as a governor, engineering the sale of this land at very convenient prices. And this is only one example out of hundreds. Of course, I don't have time to go through more of them. So essentially, why in Afghanistan, as we know, this coercive broker did not lead to successful state making. I don't need to elaborate on that. We now all know that it was not successful. Why was it state unmaking instead? Actually, President Karzai did try to turn this into some kind of recipe for state formation. He did try to form a nationwide, if you like, coalition of coercive brokers, not that he would use this terminology. This was essentially invented by Francisco very recently. So Karzai, first of all, probably wouldn't read a lot of academic texts. But anyway, nobody had come up with the idea yet. But essentially, we could describe those as coercive brokers. Is not centrally what the intervening Americans or European powers had in mind. They oppose this, not necessarily for noble reasons, quite a few, possibly majority of these coercive brokers were seen very negatively, especially by the Americans, because of their relations with Iran and other countries like Russia. So they made them unpopular with Americans. There might also be, of course, other reasons as well, but I think this is an important one. There was, of course, this emergent middle class in the cities that didn't like, these coercive brokers, didn't like what they represented, and certainly had diverging interest. I think an important aspect, though, is that the flow of aid and cash into the country, accompanying the growing presence of foreign military forces, acted against the consolidation of this coalition, because it created competition among these coercive brokers for control over that flow of aid, and therefore destabilized the coalition. The conflict within the coalition increased because everybody wanted to be in the best possible position to intercept the flow of aid. And also at the same time, the agenda of especially the American, but in general, the intervening powers from Europe and North America, of creating increasingly large national army and police forces, worried the coercive brokers, because of course, projecting over time that raised a scenario where eventually they would be sidelined. They would not be in a position to blackmail the central government anymore. At the same time, there were also regional actors who saw US intervention as against their interest, tried to sow dissent among the coercive brokers to resist this policy of creating a stronger central government in Afghanistan. And of course, Karzai lasted 2 mandates, and he could not get a 3rd mandate because it was forbidden by the constitution. His successor, President Ghani, actually went for a completely different model. He essentially had this Kemalist belief in a very strong central government. Of course, by the time he became president in 2014, he at least had an army that was already quite sizable, had large police forces. So the context was different, of course. But he did try to go against the coercive brokers. He broke the coalition, or tried to break it, and turned against them gradually. And that, of course, created an open conflict. But I think there is also one more reason, very important reason, for the failure of this attempt, and this one more reason that explains why, in Afghanistan at least, the coercive brokers did not result in any kind of state making, however primitive or feudalistic, if you like. Essentially, we could describe Afghanistan as emerged from the first emirate, just after American intervention, as a few cities were the seat of government, surrounded by borderlands in all directions. With that, I mean areas which were essentially outside the control of the government, and that led to the development of, if you like, a political economy that soon started acquiring a vested interest in the absence of a strong government. So the state was not able to control what was going on in these borderlands, and I already explained this. Of course, it led to the goal of coercive brokers. Karzai tried to ally with them. In the meanwhile, over the years, these coercive brokers organized not only control over territory and population, but also organized the local economy according to their interest. And as I mentioned, some of the coercive brokers were smugglers, others were local businessmen, if you like, were exploiting illegally or in a way without state license, local mines, and were exploiting other economic activities at the local level. And this statelessness became an asset, because essentially, of course, if you are a smuggler, having a weak government, being able to move your goods around without impediment and easily cross borders and smuggle into neighboring countries is an asset. At that point, the coercive brokers were not interested in having a state of any description, a state that could or would have to enforce the rule of law over the borderlands. The borderlands were good as aware. So I think this is a key reason why Karzai's experiment attempt to create some kind of state based on the coercive brokers as the only viable option was doomed to failure, because essentially it was contradictory. The allies that he chose to form a state were actually actors that rapidly developed an interest against the consolidation of the state. They were more interested in the lawless borderlands continue as aware, as opposed to consolidating any kind of government control, even a kind of federalistic state control over the borderlands. Because of course, especially in the context of international intervention, any state would have been asked and required to enforce the law, especially—
1 minute, Antonio, 1 minute.
I'm closing down, yeah. Of course, it was the only, one of the main requests, one of the main rationales for intervention in Afghanistan, at least as far as the Europeans were concerned, was controlling the drug trade out of Afghanistan. So it was obvious that any consolidation of the state would have led to increasing demands for the government to take action on that front. And I've run out of time, so I will stop here, actually.
Thank you very much indeed, Antonio. I'm actually finding this sort of juxtaposition of Afghanistan and Colombia extremely fascinating, because it does raise questions about, the whole idea of what is this relationship between these brokers, their coercive character, the state, political actors, etc., and the economy. And just a minute, I need to start my video. Sorry about that. I'm waiting for some questions to come up. Please put your questions in the chat and I'll give priority to those. But while we wait, while you were talking, and these two so different, these countries, and as Francisco was saying, Colombia with a reputation for institutionality, with a reputation for democracy, the military being much more controlled by civilian politicians. And here we have this phenomenon of coercive brokerage. In Afghanistan, just completely the opposite, without that history of institutionality. And I was just wondering, just to sort of throw open the issue of the concepts we're using in both cases, Antonio, what do you learn from Colombia? And Francisco, what do you learn from Afghanistan about what helps you to sort of actually develop the concepts that you're using? Is it just the specificities that are of interest and the concepts just help illuminate to some extent the specificities, or is there something more than that? So I'll ask Francisco to see if he wants to come in on that one. Have we lost Francisco? Oh no, here he is.
Yeah, okay. So allow me to be a little bit Aristotelian. You only know your own case in the difference, in the comparison with others. So yeah, that's an important dimension. But at the same time, I think if you, let's say, going a little bit up in the ladder of abstraction, these concepts are tremendously useful to understand processes of ongoing state formation and the very complex relationship between the political system, war economies, and state formation in the midst of war. So yeah, I think that the cases, first of all, allow us to look, or the difference between the cases, to look at how these issues pan out at different levels of development, of being very, very brutal, different levels of different per capita income, for example, and at the same time, very different processes of state formation and politics. So if I understood well the spirit of the question, I think it's absolutely key to think these things in a comparative perspective, not only to understand how the concepts should be developed or in which direction, but also to understand your own case.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. Antonio, do you want to add briefly? So we've got 2 questions come up in the chat, but if you wanted to just sort of respond to that, and then I'll take the 2 questions.
Very quickly, I mean, actually, of course, Francisco developed this concept of coercive brokers from the context of Colombia. And when I read about it, I found it quite for Afghanistan as well. So I think, of course, probably, if I had to fine tune the definition specific to Afghanistan, it would be slightly different from a definition optimized for Colombia. And I'm sure that if we bring in additional case studies, the definition of coercive broker would have to be more, if you like, balanced, taking into account different contexts. But I think there is a serious potential there. And for me, at least, and I'm not sure whether Francisco would agree, but for me, the most interesting aspect of it is this idea of collective action being always problematic. So you need to have a network that makes it possible, where people don't come together of their own initiative. Somebody has to do that for them. It needs to bring them together. It needs, because it wants to do it, but also because other actors, could be foreign states, could be a central government, could be whoever, wants somebody there who can deliver for them. Deliver means territorial control, population control, control over a road, control over whatever is there to be controlled. So the reason can vary a lot, but I think different types of actors throughout the spectrum would need somebody there. If you cannot find somebody that suits you, that is aligned ideologically with you, you still need that act. In Afghanistan, we have seen governments of the left, the right, Islamists, liberals, all relying on militias because they didn't have another choice. So ideology aside, by default, you do need a local actor to deliver for you.
Sorry about that. I think I lost internet for a while. So
Jenny,
let me...
Could I add something?
Yes, add something quickly, and then we'll go to the questions. Yeah.
There is, let's say, the basic issue is that when the relationship, because the state is a very territorial concept, actually also the political system as we understand it today is also a very territorial concept. So as long as the relationship between the central state and the territories is not administrated through a stable, universalistic, etc., bureaucracies, there is a large space for the creation of violent or coercive brokerage. So I think this underlying concept travels well comparatively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right, so we've got some questions in the chat. I'm just going to read them out. Just a minute, my internet is not working very well. I do apologize. Questions came up and now they've disappeared. Great. Let me just see if... Right. So here I've got the questions. Right, for Francisco, given the current animosity in Colombia between politicians on the left and those on the right, what are the risks that some of these paramilitary organizations and armed groups might be reactivated? A great many Colombians would prefer to control armed groups in the country by maintaining a framework for peace. To that end, what preventive measures might the Colombian government take to prevent potential violence from occurring? From Catherine Secha.
Could I answer right now or wait for?
Yes. No, I would go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so these are large issues. In this moment, we have groups that are akin to the paramilitaries and that stemmed from the peace agreement with the paramilitaries, not with the FARC, with the peace agreement with the paramilitaries in 2006, 2007. These groups are actually quite large, but they are also different from the classical paramilitaries in the sense that, for example, the relationship with the army is very different, also with the police. It is not this strategic relation and sometimes a sponsorship by the security agencies of the state from which the paramilitaries benefited so much. And besides, there was a large fracture between the civilian far right and the paramilitaries, because the paramilitaries felt that they had been double-crossed during the peace agreement due to the extradition of some of their major dons. So these new groups that inherited, let's say, the paramilitary tradition are different, and at this moment they are involved in the proposal, and they have accepted the proposal of total peace by President Petro. By the way, they also lost part of their link, not completely, but part of the link with legal war economies like cattle ranching, oil palm, etc., palm oil, etc. So it's a complicated situation, and regarding the policy question, I think I am not in a position to answer it because it's complicated. It would take too much time, and probably I don't have the elements to provide an answer, let's say, regarding the prevention of the development of new paramilitary groups. My point would be that, and this highlights let's say, is another way of looking at the comparative question that Jenny just issued. Let's say these groups, let's say at each cycle of violence, these groups change, their sets of alliances change, their position in war changes. There is nothing essentially violent or reactionary, not even in cattle ranching, actually. As one can see, for example, comparing la violencia dynamics with the counterinsurgent war. So let's say the relationship between brokers, specialists of violence, economies of war, and politicians is always in the flux. So it's
yeah, no, I think that's an incredibly important point. Antonio, I'm going to give you the next question. Is there evidence of a dynamic on concentration of power among coercive brokers that is connected to their relative power control over key illicit commodities? Or is there more of a tendency to share among coercive brokers?
Right. Well, certainly, I can answer for Afghanistan. Certainly, the tendency has been for the Taliban during the conflict, on the conflict was going on, to reach agreements and understandings with coercive brokers over local resources. So, for example, there were a lot of agreements over mining operations where they would be taxed by the Taliban but operated by coercive broker, or where coercive broker Taliban would share the taxation or even share the exploitation, or joint ventures, if you like, to exploit mining operations, for example. And there were also agreements over drug routes, over smuggling operations, etc. I think that was tactical. The Taliban, even before they took power, they started trying to take over as much as possible, for example, the drug trade, because they wanted to move toward the monopolization of taxation, essentially. They wanted to control it more and more. And as soon as they took power, of course, they marginalized the other actors and they took complete control of all the mining operations that were previously jointly exploiting. So I would say in the long run, a movement like the Taliban, which aims, anyway, has been aiming to central power, is incompatible with the coercive brokers. In the sense, the Taliban are the alter ego of President Ghani in terms of their approach. It's a completely different idea of centralism, but the idea is still of a monopolization of the means of coercion, but also taxation, which is not what Karzai had. So in that sense, tactical collusion, but strategic divergence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I've got more questions here. One here for Francisco, and I'm going to bring in another one to Francisco so that, and then bring another question that's for both you and Antonio and Francisco, okay? So for Francisco, given the current animosity in Colombia between politicians on the left and those on the right, what are the risks that some of these paramilitary organizations and armed groups might be oh, sorry, that's one we've already done. I really apologize. I apologize. Sorry. Here's another one from Christopher Kramer. Francisco, I'd love to learn a bit more from Francisco about the relationship between these groups and their trajectories, relations to the state and the peace settlement. Had their interests changed? Did the politics shift to reduce their value to the state? Something else? And then about their role post-war. So I'll give you that one, Francisco, and then I'll come back to the one that's for both of you.
Perfect. So, hi, Chris. So, let's say the paramilitaries in Colombia were created in 1965 and 1966 through a specific institutional device which allowed the army to sponsor the creation of private self-defense groups that would protect the population from the guerrillas. This institutional mechanism was not activated, but until 10 or 12 years later, but allowed the paramilitaries to develop basically within legality. In 1989, the president of that time, Virgilio Barco, I legalized the self-defenses. But in 1994, the Colombian government adopted an institutional figure called convivir, coexistence. This was a kind of Orwellian name that basically legalized security cooperatives that absorbed the paramilitaries and their legal and open action. So during the 25 years or 30 years of their very violent saga, the paramilitaries were illegal only at most during half that period. And the paramilitaries made big inroads into the political system, as I showed, but there would be much more evidence, and had very intimate links with an assortment of civilian bureaucracies. But it was, let's say, it was never the case that the state was fully co-opted by the paramilitaries. For example, the judicial were rather hostile to the paramilitaries, or large sector of the judicial. There was a tension, and also there were some bureaucracies which they could never fully capture. At the subnational level, there was also a massive and deliberate, conscious effort to conquer municipal and departmental power. So there is this Italian researcher, Aldo Civico, who has researched this and makes an analogy once again between the Sicilian mafia and the Colombian paramilitaries, and called this intreccio, like the intermingling between the state and the paramilitaries. And I think this describes relatively well the relationship. Now, the demobilization of the paramilitaries, let's say, was, I think, the product of the extreme impact of them, not only for the livelihood of Colombians, but also for the very notion of sovereignty in Colombia. As Chris, many of you know, the Colombian concept of sovereignty is anchored in the intimate alliance or clientelistic relationship with the United States, and having this massive group. At its height, it had like 25,000 members roaming in the country, killing massively, etc. Was a brutal cost, which weakened this. So it put the Colombian state into a kind of dilemma in which to cast wide the counter-insurgent control, and to obtain more territory, it had to rely on the paramilitaries. But on the other hand, this relationship undermined quite critically its international legitimacy. So they were quite caught, the paramilitaries, and finally they demobilized. And as I just said in the previous question, these new paramilitary groups have continuities, but are also quite different from the previous ones, because their relationship with the central state is weaker, with the security agencies of the state as well, with large cattle ranchers. Also, it was massively undermined. So they are still a counterinsurgent project, very much supported by narco economies, not very happy or enthusiastic vis-a-vis the civilian far rights, Uribe and all these people, because it considers them that they cheated them during the peace process. So it's let's say it's a force that whose relationship with the political economy of the country is quite different from the paramilitaries of the past. Jenny, back to you. I think we have a collective action problem, Antonio.
Do okay, it's all right.
Oh, no, okay.
I'm back.
Okay, perfect.
very apologies for this technical hitches. I'm on my iPad in university, but in SOAS, but somehow the internet's not working very well. But anyway, I think we're getting there. We're okay. We've still got 10 minutes left, and I want to give you the question to both of you from Patrick Meehan, and I'll start with you, Antonio. But here's the question: how does the dynamic of powerful anti-state actors affect the emergence and consolidation of coercive brokers? For example, FARC and the Taliban, and the constraints they place on coercive brokers in terms of controlling territory. So, Antonio.
Well, in part, I already hinted to this in my previous answer. So the Taliban, as I said, also always had this idea of aiming for power at the center, so that the centralizing project, their own type of centralizing project, very different from that of President Ghani, a centralizing project coming from the periphery, and that's the peculiarity, not coming from the center. But in a sense, they turn out to be much more of a threat for the coercive brokers than President Ghani, even if the brokers didn't realize that. The brokers toward the end of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, in the majority, they chose the Taliban over President Ghani. They thought that Ghani, at the end of the day, was more of a threat for them, apart from being also doomed, and opted to side with the Taliban in the hope that the Taliban would accommodate them, like, for example, President Karzai had done. And perhaps the Taliban would have done that if, of course, they had not won the war already, because, of course, by the time the Afghan army collapsed, the Taliban had very little, incentive to make any political deal. Having won the war, why would you share power with anybody else? And when the Taliban turned against the coercive brokers, the latter realized that the Taliban were much tougher not to crack for them because, and we go back here to clientelistic warfare, they were competing with the brokers on the same ground. So essentially, they were much more effective against the brokers because they had presence on the ground in the same villages, in the same areas, and they were in a position to undermine them much more effectively because they had their own patronage links at the local level, and therefore they're not like somebody coming from the center, from far away, trying to prevaricate without having any base locally. They had a base as well. And of course, we can see today that they've been most successful where the Taliban are strongest. They completely wiped out the competition throughout the Pashtun belt in Afghanistan, and also in those pockets of northern Afghanistan where the Taliban were able to establish a presence. Where the Taliban have been weak throughout the conflict, which is most of the northeast and the north, but not all of it. The Taliban are struggling today in completely eradicating the coercive brokers because they're not able to compete with them at the local level for this, they're not able to establish the same kind of relationship of patronage that they've been able to develop elsewhere. And I think I'll stop here to give Francisco some things about.
Over to you, Francisco.
So there's a kind of co-evolution here because, let's say, the FARC started, all this is quite strange and surprising. The FARC was created as a self-defense, exactly as the Paras. And precisely the idea was to arm civilians to be able to fight back these kind of civilian rebel groups, these peasant rebels. But this created the incentives for the FARC to evolve in a quite different direction. So the FARC really went through a process of creating itself as an army. There's a very beautiful biography of the FARC leader, Tiro Fijo, by Arturo Alape. And at some moment, the author asks Tiro Fijo which were the two books that he went back to permanently. And Tiro Fijo gave the title of one, a collection of edifying stories from the Vietnam War, and the other one was the manual of organizational behavior for the Colombian sergeants and sub-officers. So Tiro Fijo was really an army builder, and in 1982 the FARC declared itself FARC-EP. So FARC, Army of the People. And this shows very well how organizational blueprints impinge on the way in which war develops, because this particular form of organization was very effective against the paramilitary counterinsurgent strategy of the Colombian state. Because the Colombian state strategy was take the, as in classical counterinsurgent manuals, take the water out from the fish through terrorism, violence, etc., etc. But the FARC were a fish no more. They were kind of amphibian, and they developed a tremendous military capacity that was able to hold throughout this highly paramilitarized war. Now, the other aspect of the question would be the relationship of the FARC with the politicians in their own territories. There are very good works on this, but there is still not, I think, not yet a general understanding of the issue. So I will speak, let's say, I will skip this part of the answer, which is important. But I think it has to be investigated a bit more.
Thank you very much indeed, Francisco and Antonio. We're running out of time now, and I've got two questions if there's time, and I don't think there is, we've got 4 minutes left. So I'm going to just read them so that they're registered and just see if either of you want to make a quick comment before we close. So one of them is from Ian Strong, which he wants to know your opinion on the future of the Mexican state. Obviously, the United States would like to appear to be interested in the stability of the Mexican government. But American demand for narcotics transiting through Mexico has facilitated the empowerment of cartels like that of Sinaloa that can challenge the authority of the state. The situation seems fairly similar to the role of militias belonging to strongmen and smugglers operating alongside Taliban rule in Afghanistan, where the government and militias would likely prefer not to engage in direct conflict with one another. Very interesting question. I'd like to contribute to that myself as I'm working a lot on Mexico, but let me go. I don't know whether I have time. Let's go to a question from Fritz Pinot. Quick question to Francisco. You had said that the paramilitaries are detached from the civilian far right. How would you characterize the emergence of the gente de bien during the Paro Nacional, the people of wealth, of good? Are they paramilitaries or civilian? Right, so do either of you have any quick comments on either Mexico or on the paramilitaries and the civilian far right?
Would you go ahead, Antonio, if you have something to say?
Very quickly, I think with regard to Afghanistan and Mexico, in Afghanistan, in reality, what's happening is that the smugglers operate alongside the Taliban as long as they pay tax to the Taliban. So the Taliban consider them as any other kind of business. You pay tax, fine. If you don't pay tax, they come after you, and they're quite effective at nabbing those who don't pay taxes to them. So I'm not sure, however, what the actual situation in Mexico is, so I want to comment on Mexico.
Francisco.
Yeah. Now, the question on Mexico highlights the importance of looking at all these issues comparatively, so I will leave it there. And with respect to the gente de bien, so the decent people, or self-styled decent people. So during the large popular mobilizations that took place in Colombia in 2019 and 2020, the gente de bien is a very old term. It's decades long, but during these mobilizations, some very angry, high and high middle class people in the cities. So the paramilitaries were a very rural phenomenon. This happened in the cities. Took some guns and some shot the people, and in other cases they tried to organize to provide an armed response against the popular mobilization taking place in the city. So this would be, I would characterize it as elite violence. It has nothing to do, to the best of my understanding, with any armed group, but instead it was organically linked with the far right. So indeed, this can stop there or can develop into another type of organization or another type of violent response from the elites. In this case, it would be the urban elites, but we don't know yet, of course. And the relationship with the groups that inherited this paramilitary trajectory is, to the best of my knowledge, is non-existing. So it was a spontaneous violence from angry members of the elites, promoted incessantly by the civilian far right.
Thank you, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But I mean, I think this last question has raised sort of some interesting issues as well about what is the role of economic actors, right? They're not all illegal criminal actors. There's this a blurred economic elites and criminal elite, but there's also mainstream, what I would call oligarchic elites. How do they relate to all of this? You've mentioned the cattle ranchers, Francisco, with different moments in their history of this relationship, and I think it'd be interesting to look at that in Afghanistan. I also find it very interesting, this issue that was raised at the very beginning in your presentations about the usefulness of coercive brokers, both to state and political actors, and maybe to economic actors, but also in Afghanistan, Antonio, you mentioned to communities, to giving order to for communities. And I think that's also an issue of interest in Colombia. All I can say is that so many more questions. I want to continue and continue because I think we've, raised all the complexities. The questions have been great. Thank you very much, everybody. Pretty time is always the enemy. Just to remind you, there's going to be another meeting on the 7th of February. So please register for the Zoom for the 7th of February, and we'll continue these discussions between RUSI and CIVAD SOAS and all our very helpful, so well-informed academic scholars who are contributing to this debate, and to all you participants tuning in. Thank you very much, everybody.